as within, so without, so in the macroscopic or something like that. That is the physical dynamic that is the substrate of our mind creating itself at each moment is the same as the physical dynamic that nature uses to create itself everywhere in the universe.
I want to introduce myself as John Clippinger at First Principles podcast. And we have the great opportunity and privilege of having Mike Weist as a speaker and an interviewer, a professor at Wellesley College, and in neuroscience. And the part of the thinking for this podcast is he gave an extraordinarily coherent presentation at a conference in Barcelona on the science of consciousness regarding microtubules, the scientific basis for microtubules, and also the implications of microtubules in quantum consciousness. And then he went on to relate it to the work of Carl Friston, who is an active inference, and noting that in order to fully understand sort of neuroscience cognitive states of consciousness, you really have to consider it as quantum consciousness and put it in a new category of thinking. And Carl he referenced a paper that we discussed here, and also the authors of a discussion on that paper, Michael Levin and Chris Fields. So the kind of work that Mike's been doing is just dead center in the things that are of interest to us, and he's been able to present his ideas and the evidence in a very compelling frame. Mike, could you give us a little background on yourself and how you came to study these issues and your background in neuroscience and what your particular focus is?
Sure. So I am a refugee from physics. My PhD was in high energy theory, quantum physics. Towards the end of that PhD, I became excited about the fringe idea that maybe we need quantum physics to understand consciousness in the brain. And so I decided to try and get my foot in the door of neuroscience by coming in through computational neuroscience, because there was a bit of overlap with the computational work I was doing in physics. After about 3 years of that, I decided I didn't want to spend my career begging experimentalists for their data to analyze. So I spent another 6 or 7 years in the Nicolaus lab at Duke, learning how to do multi-electrode recordings, chronic multi-electrode recordings in rats. And then in 2008, I came to Wellesley College here in Massachusetts as an assistant professor, and I'm an associate professor now. So I've been focusing on neural correlates of sensory integration, attention, and perception in the rat brain, and the multi-electrode arrays I use allow me to look at questions about synchronization among neural activities in different parts of the brain. But in a sense, this all has been, for the past 25 years or so, I've been infiltrating the academy as to bring in a viewpoint that's not mainstream so far.
Yes. To that point, is it still is it growing mainstream? I mean, this is the conversation I had with Michael Levin. I mean, and you look at Carl, and you look at his standing, and yet it's taken a real fight in order to get these ideas across. It seems to me that the computational model is getting greater receptivity. It's explanatory power is translating to AI. It's translating to technology. You have quantum computers. But is there still the strong institutional resistance to these ideas? It seems to me that it's still there. It's not it's certainly not mainstream, but is it making its way into mainstream? And what would it take? I mean, it fascinates me institutionally, because I had that in my own career. Being in interest in artificial intelligence 50 years ago was not mainstream.
What it will take is some compelling experiments, and we're starting to get that with the room temperature superradiance that you mentioned. There's still just a lot of resistance, though, and it comes from the intuition that most of the time when we try to use quantum effects in our technology, we have to make things super cold. And that's been the intuition that said our brain is just too hot. There were always theoretical reasons that was not conclusive, but now we're starting to get the experimental evidence. And so, yeah, it's very gradual, though, that people don't really tend to change their minds in real life. But you are seeing some of the original skeptics, the original skeptics from the 90s, are now coming out with papers about quantum
Oh,
consciousness
really?
themselves, like Christoph Koch
Oh,
and Max Tegmark had a weird paper about quantum integrated information.
yes.
So yeah, there,
What was
but
it? Was
there
it
aren't
Max
many
Planck?
real converts. What's that?
Or was it Max Planck said that science progresses at one funeral at a time? I think was
I
it.
I hadn't heard that one,
Yeah, well, unfortunately, that was
but
a long
sometimes
time
it feels
ago,
that way.
and
Yeah,
but also, I think what you're seeing in the sciences is opening up to the. It's not just confined to the universities, and now it is the open science. I mean, open. I mean, I see this in computers and everything else. Is that one time it was dominated by personalities, and now it's open up, and people can. Now there's funding from multiple sources, so it's not confined to the traditional academia anymore.
that's right. You get discussions of these issues on social media, and to some extent, that means some of the voices are not really serious voices, but
No, that's true too. It's true. I mean, I guess one of the things that we're interested here as well is actually building sort of conscious agents, and what does it mean? I mean, Stuart Hoffman, I mean, it's not Stuart Hoffman, but Don Hoffman heads a piece on sort of traces of consciousness, and sort of he gave that talk on sort of the sort of a Markov models and kernels around consciousness. I think that now you're getting the movement into theories and actually building things that embody that. I think that's it's a new phenomenon as well. And so if you start to having a more effective learning aware sentient agents that meet certain criteria, then I think that sort of pulls the science along too. Would you agree with that? Are you seeing that?
I agree with that in principle, but I don't think, maybe I'm generalizing too much here, but I don't think anyone's building anything right now that
Right.
is
No, no, that
giving
meets
us
that
insight
criteria.
into
Yeah. Yeah.
consciousness.
No, yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, why don't we get your slides up, and we can talk about those. Beginning with your slide on microtubules.
Right. Let's see if I can find.
Sure.
Yeah, I used this picture to symbolize the hard problem, the so-called hard problem or mind-body problem, in which the bricks represent the physical matter we're made out of, and the eye represents the mysterious consciousness that seems to bloom out of that physical matter. Here was the outline of my talk, where I broke it into an experimental part, mainly experimental evidence, including my modest experiment in rats, and then I had conceptual issues in the second part. So I guess, yeah, starting from,
Well, just for this audience, I mean, the whole idea of what MTs are and why that's important, and why that I think that becomes because I don't think it can be presumed for this particular audience.
yeah, so what I'm going to be suggesting is that microtubules, and I'll tell you more about those, but they are literal tubes made out of protein that are inside all of our cells, including our nerve cells. They have special roles and special organization and special accessory proteins in neurons in brain cells as compared to other parts of the body. And so I have a bit of, well, the hypothesis on the table is that our consciousness is a property of vibrations of these microtubules, of the dipole, the electric dipoles that they're made out of, a collective vibration of the microtubules in our brain cells. The hypothesis is that is the physical substrate of our consciousness. And aside from the evidence I'm going to talk about here, this is also kind of plausible because, in a biological or evolutionary sense, because from the very beginning of life, from this in single-celled organisms, microtubules are already playing a very dynamic role integrating sensory information and coordinating movement. So it's microtubules that are inside the filopodia and cilia and various kinds of legs that single-celled organisms have and are participating with other parts of the cytoskeleton in actually swimming and crawling and so on. It's microtubules. One of my slides is about how it's microtubules that coordinate or choreograph the beautiful dance of the chromosomes during mitosis. So in the middle are the chromosomes being pulled apart. What's pulling them apart are microtubules, and what's coordinating all that is a so-called microtubule organizing center, which is also made out of microtubules. You've probably heard that they function like railroad tracks for little munchkins that carry proteins to different parts of the cell. There are even a series of papers in which Gunther Albrecht Buehler shows in some really nice experiments that in some single-celled organisms, microtubules appear to be detecting electromagnetic radiation, infrared light, and not only detecting it, but detecting what direction it's coming from so that the cell can orient itself with respect to that. So, they act like little eyes and little nerves inside single cells and kind of like muscles as well. So they kind of do the whole business of life, aside from the replication. And so, yeah, I use this slide to stand for a whole range of phenomena showing that although they are called part of the cytoskeleton and they're stiff and they have a function like bones, they're not just bones for the cell. They're not just tent poles holding up the cell. They have many functions. And so this quantum consciousness hypothesis is tacking on to that, and it sort of makes sense of the continuity between life and consciousness that's starting to be noted by neuroscientists.
It's really a profound point. Yes, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, so that's making the connection between life and consciousness. Now, another way to make this connection is by considering anesthesia, which are medically miraculous. So we have volatile anesthetics and we have different kinds of injectable anesthetics. I'm focusing on the volatile ones. We vaporize them and breathe them in like a gas. And it turns out those kind work on everything alive, not just us and primates or mammals, but also invertebrates, single-celled creatures that have no neurons at all, and even plants. And so for those creatures, we don't know if they're conscious, but what we can observe is these gases reversibly stop their wiggling around. And so Claude Bernard basically used anesthesia almost as a definition of life. If it's alive, it can be anesthetized. So I've already pointed out some of these things don't have neurons, but they're sensitive to the same chemicals that put us to sleep for surgery. So this is a table showing a list of proteins and cellular components that volatile anesthetics bind to. And so these are candidate molecular targets that might be part of how these gases make us unconscious. I circled the microtubules, because those are the ones I'm going to focus on. So the field tends to assume that because these gases are so, they say, promiscuous, they bind to many different proteins, the assumption is they probably make us unconscious by some combined effect on many different proteins. But there are a number of facts that suggest instead that although they bind to many things, the functional effect on consciousness is coming from one main target, one main molecular target. And the first of these facts is the so-called Meyer-Overton correlation here, which is this linear relationship although it's on the log-log scale, but this very strict relationship between how well these different chemicals are, how soluble they are in olive oil, that predicts how much you need of that anesthetic to put someone to sleep. So the solubility in lipids is predicting how effective these chemicals are as an anesthetic, and why that's suggestive, or why it's remarkable, is that these different chemicals on the chart are very diverse chemically. Some of them are just single elements, single atoms, like nitrogen, krypton, xenon. Xenon is an anesthetic at a high enough concentration. So these chemicals don't really have chemical similarities. What they have in common is their tendency to go into hydrophobic pockets in cells. That's the solubility in fatty stuff. Excuse me. So that relationship is suggesting that rather than some kind of specific chemical lock and key binding, as is typical of most drugs, these kinds of drugs maybe are interacting by a relatively non-specific physical interaction. Similarly, the second part here, the second panel, is to argue against the idea that these gases are primarily working on ion channels. So ion channels are the gates in the membranes of our neurons that let charged ions in and out, and that's how we create the electrical signals that neurons use to communicate with each other, and that they use to communicate with muscles. So we know that whatever a mind is, it must be able to translate its commands into action potentials to talk to muscles. And so that's, because ion channels govern those action potentials, that's why people tend to focus on the ion channels as the likely targets of anesthetics. But if you consider that what this chart is showing is how, if you take the half of an effective dose of one anesthetic and half of an effective dose of another anesthetic dose, you can put them together and get approximately one effective dose. But the pairs here are chosen such that one of the chemicals in the pair has a strong effect on a particular ion channel receptor, like maybe the inhibitory GABA receptors, and the other one does not. And so the fact that you can put them together and get a full dose is arguing against any single ion channel being the primary target. And the authors who put this review together also concluded they couldn't come up with any combination of ion channels that could explain how these anesthetics put us to sleep. So those are some facts, some observations to suggest maybe there's one primary target. And the primary target I'm going to suggest is microtubules. And so this paper is some theoretical support for that idea. Tubulin are the pieces that that polymerize into microtubules. And so they did a quantum chemical simulation of different anesthetic molecules binding to tubulin, and how that binding disrupts or does not disrupt the vibrations, the dipole vibrations that I mentioned earlier, that are supposed to be the substrate of consciousness. And so they found that the more you mess with those vibrations, the stronger of an anesthetic we're talking about. And so, in other words, by assuming that anesthetics are binding to microtubules to cause their effects on consciousness, they more or less reproduce that Meyer-Overton correlation. And I don't think that can be said for any other candidate molecular target. So this is consistent with the possibility that microtubules are the main molecular target by which volatile anesthetics make us unconscious. And so that's also consistent with the possibility that they might be the substrate of consciousness. It doesn't prove it by itself. And moreover, there's some further evidence I want to mention. Here's a bit more about microtubules, what they look like in an EM electron micrograph, and you can see the so-called microtubule associated proteins forming these cross bridges amongst them, so they allow them to make larger scale structures, and they also help keep the microtubules from falling apart. My anesthetic result, or excuse me, my experimental result, published in 2024, is this pretty simple experiment where, excuse me, there's this class of drugs, taxane drugs, that bind to microtubules, and they are used as anti-cancer drugs, because we already mentioned how microtubules are major players in mitosis. They use these drugs against cancer. Most of these drugs don't penetrate the blood-brain barrier, so they don't get into the brain very well. But recently, people have been developing versions of these drugs that do get into the brain, and so we gave one of those to our rats, and simply observed that when we exposed them to isoflurane, a particular anesthetic gas that's also used on humans, if they had EPOB in their system binding to microtubules, then it took them longer to fall unconscious under the gas. Here's what it looked like, how we measured unconsciousness. It's the latency to the loss of writing reflex. That means if you flip the rat on its back, if it's awake, it will immediately flip itself back onto its feet. And so we also made sure the people taking this measurement were blind to whether the rat had EPOB or not. And then we got these results showing that it took them 69 seconds longer on average to fall asleep if they had EPOB in their system. And so the way we interpret that is the EPOB is binding to the microtubules, and it's taking them longer to fall asleep in that condition. So we're inferring the isoflurane was trying to bind to the microtubules to make the rats go asleep. That by itself does not implicate a quantum model, so we can consider how you might account for that finding under a classical model. And in both quantum and classical models, the focus is not on raw firing rates, but on functional connectivity. So both kinds of viewpoints agree that if you disconnect different parts of the brain, then you go unconscious. And so one way we could imagine that happening under the classical model is if isoflurane is somehow messing with the microtubules, and I mentioned how they're like railroad tracks for proteins that get taken to different places in the cell, but that includes synaptic proteins and synaptic transmitters. So we can imagine if you mess up that transport along the microtubules, maybe you would slow down or eliminate synaptic release at axon terminals, and that could overall reduce activity and cause disconnection of different parts of the brain. And so that's a potential way we could imagine, even if the brain is purely classical, even if consciousness is purely classical, how we could get such a result. But I'm showing it as not supported because experimentally we have couple of studies showing that, in fact, this gas isoflurane does affect synaptic transmission, but those papers looked into the mechanism by which the gas affects synaptic transmission, and it involved mitochondria and synaptic proteins rather than the microtubules. So that effect on synaptic transmission doesn't seem to be through microtubules, current evidence. So that leads me to consider the alternative, the quantum idea, noting along the way this bit of evidence that, so this is a study of tadpoles now. We don't know if they're conscious or not, but this group engineered, so this is a completely different kind of anesthesia, but they engineered an anesthetic that was targeting microtubules specifically, and they found they could stop their tadpoles from swimming around reversibly just by targeting microtubules. So supporting that microtubules might be enough by themselves to to cause unconsciousness, which is consistent with the possibility that they are the substrate of consciousness. Okay, but why this obsession with the quantum models? This is the end of my abstract of our experimental rat paper, and we say this finding is predicted by models that posit consciousness as a property of a quantum physical state of neural microtubules. So I know you're interested in the experimental evidence, and I definitely want to tell you about that. But I kind of want to emphasize the motivation for this idea in the first place. Because, you hear from Hameroff and Penrose, and Hameroff will emphasize his expertise about the biology of microtubules, and Penrose will emphasize his expertise and his contribution in terms of the Gödel theorem argument about how human understanding can't be algorithmic. It's somewhat subtle and contentious, but in my view, there's a much more straightforward motivation and essentially a way to see that a classical model cannot work to explain consciousness, and we have to go to a quantum model, and that's the binding problem, what's called the binding problem in cognitive neuroscience. So here's a way it's expressed in a neuroscience textbook. In my talk, I said, there's a chair over there. It has a gray color and a certain shape. The color might be represented by neurons in one place and the shape by neurons in another place. But I experience that and my whole visual field as one unified experience. How can we account for that? And moreover, how can we understand that that unified experience could be causally efficacious? That's a second thing, because it seems like these states evolved. This is an argument due to William James. Because fire hurts and ripe fruit tastes good, my conscious states are giving me good advice about what to do, like take your hand out of the fire. So it really seems like they must have evolved, but in order to evolve, they must have some effect on my behavior. That seems like a paradox or an insoluble problem, but I think we've got a solution to that problem too. But on the way, we have to solve this binding problem, which is accounting for this irreducibly unified experience we have in terms of physics that is usually pretty reducible, at least classic. These slides are different ways of expressing this binding problem. So here's William James' example of 10 men. You give them each a word from a sentence and tell them to think it really hard. And even if you jam them together really close in a bunch, nowhere is there a consciousness of the whole sentence. And so his point already in 1890 was neurons have the same problem, and they're not even touching each other, we know now. So that's the binding problem expressed in one way. And the suggestion is that a quantum physical state will avoid or will solve that problem by being an irreducible whole. I think I need to unpack that a little more. The inconvenient truth is that classical models are ruled out if we want to account for the evolution of biological consciousness. And this is why. All classical physics is locally deterministic, emphasis on the local here. So in other words, everything, and this is what Leibniz said before quantum physics, parts pushing on their neighbors only. If you imagine the brain blown up like a mill that you could walk into, Leibniz said, you go inside, all you're going to see are parts pushing on each other. You're not going to see a perception anywhere in there. And so my point here with pointing this out about classical physics is that, sure, we talk about big things in classical physics. We talk about waves, we talk about vortices like a tornado. But in classical physics, all those names for big things like a tornado are in principle only for convenience. Because in principle, we could completely describe that thing in terms of the molecules of air bouncing off only their neighbors. Okay, so it seems hard for people to accept this, but I'm saying categorically that any big thing in a classical model, this goes for classical electromagnetic fields just as much as so-called matter particles and everything else. In a classical model, all the classical laws are expressed as differential equations. The dx's are telling us things only interact at infinitesimally separated neighbors. And so again, everything can be reduced to those. And so if we have a classical brain and we postulate that such and such pattern of activity corresponds or it comes with this conscious experience, what this fact implies, is that consciousness must be epiphenomenal, because we can completely eliminate it from the description and still have a complete predictive theory of what that brain does. So if it's a classical brain, consciousness is doomed to being epiphenomenal, and we can never explain how it could have evolved. That's what I'm calling the inconvenient truth, because nobody wants to believe that, because everyone's exploring classical models of consciousness.
That's
They
really
have to
interesting. Yeah. So you're saying it gets back to the James example. You have just with proximity of neighbors doesn't yield a unified experience. Is that there's other than resorting to the epiphenomenal hand wave, basically.
Right. I mean, if you want, you're not able to say that
Right.
my consciousness gives me a selective advantage, and that's why it
Right.
evolved, or anything like that. It's a weird dangler with no explanation but God, if you want to go that route.
Yeah. Right. Right.
And yeah, so that's how Spinoza made fun of Descartes.
That's nicely said. Yeah. That makes sense to me. Yes.
Good. And so, but when you try to tell it to someone else,
That's right.
they're going to start saying waves, and they're going to start saying, what about the electromagnetic field? That seems really unified. But if you just look at Maxwell's equations, you can see it's not as unified as you thought. It's just one bit at a time, just like everything else in a classical
Wow.
model.
That's in Maxwell's equations as well. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't have to have them memorized. All you have to remember is their differential equations.
Yeah. Okay. That's true. Yeah, okay. Right. Yeah.
Okay, but so it seems like the quantum model is going to fall to the same problem. And so, but in terms, sticking with the binding problem, so we've got two problems now. There's three. There's the hard problem, there's the binding problem, and there's what I'm calling the epiphenomenalism problem. And so I'm emphasizing the irreducible holism of quantum physics as a solution to the binding problem, so that at least there's something holistic in the physics that could correspond to this consciousness that we have. Okay, so you can tell me if you want more about introducing quantum physics, but I'm just saying the evolution, unlike the classical evolution, which is all part one, it's all locally deterministic. Quantum has this extra part that people want to ignore because it's ugly and problematic, but you can't ignore it. That's what my other slide. Okay, so measurement problem. We don't know what a measurement is because the textbooks don't tell us. There are different viewpoints. The objective reduction viewpoint says it's something that really happens. It's not just that we're learning something new. Okay, and then it seems everyone brings this up, but it does require repeating because people take different lessons from this fable. But what Schrodinger was trying to say with the fable is, if you leave out that second part, the measurements, you get absurd predictions. If you leave out the measurements, you get the theory predicts alive and dead cats at the same time. Those are not observed. That's why you cannot leave out the measurements. And that's why I'm going with objective reduction, though it's controversial.
That's really interesting.
Objective reduction is the thesis that wave function collapse is a real physical process. In this theory of consciousness, the suggestion is that in non-living matter, these collapses happen all the time too, not just in us, but when it happens in non-living matter, it's disconnected little electrons just deciding where they're going to be at that moment. We call that proto-consciousness. But living organisms have evolved different kinds of structures like microtubules and neurons to orchestrate those disconnected moments of collapse into bigger ones that are somehow representing information that's useful to us, so that the collapse does a useful computation, makes a decision about how we're going to interpret what we're seeing and what we're going to do about it, as in active inference. And moreover, the suggestion is that it's microtubules in particular are the main substrate of this macroscopic entangled quantum state. It has to be macroscopic. It can't just be in one neuron if it's going to solve this binding problem, because different features that I'm experiencing together are scattered across centimeters, not just microns.
Whoa. But it's also, you see, evolutionary. I mean, you say that microtubules, the early forms of life, evolved in more complex forms over time. I mean, and mitosis. I mean, if it's in mitosis, it's so fundamental.
But in single cells, it looks like they're already integrating environmental information to decide how to move. And what we do with our brain is just that on a bigger scale.
Yeah, that's what I was getting. But it's also that, and we'll get this, I guess, into talking about the active inference of the paper, but also the whole holographic principle that that comes into that, and what the nature of a cell is embodying that.
Yeah, the idea of agents all the way down.
Yes.
I think Michael Levin likes to talk about that.
Yeah, exactly.
We can make contact with that too, in a pretty wild way. If you
Yeah,
remind me.
well, I'm ready to go there when
All right.
when you are right. But I
Okay.
mean, but it arises from this. I mean, it's not. Yeah.
Well, okay, yeah. So let me go ahead while we're there.
Sure.
I'll
No,
make
go
a
ahead.
quick comment about that. So one of the sources of experimental evidence that I'm going to mention comes from Anirban Bandyopadhyay's lab. He's got a lot of amazing experiments. And what I emphasize here is these 2 points: that he's able to stimulate resonances, these vibrations that we were talking about in microtubules, and show that they do interact with membrane voltage. So that's important because we said membrane voltage is where the action potentials happen. They're what talks to muscles. So if the mind is really in the microtubules need a way to talk to the action potentials, to the membrane. This is showing they do. And if the microtubules are going to know about the sensory information, there must be communication from the membrane potential to the microtubules as well. And I can talk about how that might happen. But what's on this slide as well is Anirban Bandyopadhyay showing experimentally that not only do these microtubule vibrations control spiking activity on the membrane, they also span multiple neurons, which, remember, was one of the requirements if it's going to be able to solve the binding problem. And that's something that people have trouble, even if they're starting to be open to the possibility of something quantum happening in the warm brain. To say that it's going to be centimeters big sounds really hard to swallow. The evidence we're looking at here from Bandyopadhyay is not proof that it's quantum, but it's microtubules, and it's spread, and it's across neurons, and it's interacting with the membrane potential. And we do have other experimental evidence regarding the.
So there is other experimental evidence just in this has been replicated and other examples.
Well, I wouldn't call them replications. They're different kinds of experiments.
Okay.
So I can go to that. But the reason I was bringing up Bandyopadhyay with respect to that agents all the way down idea, they also use the term scale free.
Yes.
Chris Fields uses that term.
Yes.
Something that I didn't emphasize, but that Hameroff has been emphasizing lately, that comes from the Bandyopadhyay results. Hameroff talks about it in terms of time crystals, which sound very exotic. But what it's referring to is these hierarchies of oscillation frequencies. So Bandyopadhyay has found these repeating patterns of resonances at frequencies from hertz and hundreds of hertz where brain waves live, all the way to terahertz radio waves and multiple ranges in between. And there are similar, he calls them triplets of triplets, where you see these peaks in the spectrum, and each peak has three peaks, and he sees that pattern repeated at different orders of magnitude of frequency. So he's got these ideas about how those frequencies are interacting, and that's how you can get really fast responses on your slow time scale. And I think it could be related to the idea of agents all the way down, that things just keep repeating at smaller and smaller
Well,
scales.
this is. I mean, we'll get it, but this is one of the points that Carlos makes, and I've heard Chris say, what is true above is true below. I mean, so that you have this multi-scale, which is also true in alchemy. But anyway,
Right, that's where it comes from. I was going to say, if you didn't know that, you want to be aware of that.
Yeah, I know. Whoops. But
I think,
but
to be
yeah, go
frank,
ahead.
I think the connection. All right, I'm gonna say what they say: as above, so below.
Yeah.
And I think in the esoteric literature, that's referring to as within, so without, or
Right.
as in the mental, so in the macroscopic, or something like that. And I think Orch-OR instantiates that. That is the physical dynamic that is the substrate of our mind creating itself at each moment is the same as the physical dynamic that nature uses to create itself everywhere in the
Yeah,
universe.
I mean that you have to stop and take a breath. I mean, I had because I was just looking at I was looking out at my farm and it was all green. I suddenly just looking at all of the variety and seeing in nature, realizing itself simultaneously as a dynamic, and that is like it's a shock. I mean, it's like not how you're taught to think about it, right? I mean.
Right. It's we're verging on panpsychism here.
Oh yeah, I mean it definitely. And then when you start to think about things, then you see things very differently. I mean, this is such a paradigm shift in the Kuhnian sense
Right.
that it clearly it's shaking the pillars of established interest.
I
So
think
it's
so.
not going to be easily accepted, but
Right.
I see the evidence is more and more there in my mind. It has explanatory powers. I guess the other thing when I started talking to Carl about this and the whole idea of something that is multi-scale, it is multi-scale scalar, and you have these nested levels of competence, and it's also multi-domain. That's a huge claim. I mean, it's like, oh my God,
Yeah,
But if
I'm
that's
not sure if
true,
I'm going all the way with that. I'm
okay,
pointing out
I'd be
that there's
interested.
some possible source or possible support in these hierarchies of frequencies. I don't imagine we can go all. I mean, I
Well, the
feel
free
like there
energy
has to be a
principle.
bottom somewhere,
Well,
but I'm not
I
sure.
but the free energy principle itself. I mean, is an organizing. It's almost like it provides a metric that is scale free and domain free in some sense. That is an organizing metric that I find very useful in other areas and how to apply that. And if that exists, then it allows for
Right.
a lot of things you other wouldn't be
Here,
possible.
I. So now we're kind of going to my other talk, and I don't want to forget to show you the direct biophysical evidence
No,
we
no,
have.
sure. I don't want to. Yeah, go.
But
Keep me on channel here. Yeah.
but yeah, I definitely want to talk about active inference too. Okay,
Okay, okay.
so
No, we'll get there. All right, we'll
okay,
put that.
so
I'll put on.
this is the one you had heard about or mentioned about microtubules. They avoided the word microtubules and just talked about tubulin here, but these are structures, bigger and bigger structures made out of tubulin, including microtubules and bigger things made out of microtubules. The specific phenomenon is called superradiance, where you get coherent radiation analogous to a laser, but it's spontaneous fluorescence. And so they see it at room temperature. That's thing one, which is already what people have been saying for 30 years couldn't happen. But moreover, as they make the structures bigger, the effect gets stronger. And that's the opposite of the usual prejudice that quantum stuff gets weaker as you make things bigger. So these are special structures. And superradiance has already been contemplated by people who are thinking about making quantum computers as a possible way to get your different qubits to be entangled. And maybe let me make the connection to a optical computer so we can sort of picture how this might happen somewhat concretely. So in this figure, this is supposed to be a dendrite with microtubules in it, okay? And these are an axon with multiple synaptic terminals onto other dendrites. I'm showing the microtubules in green, and I'm showing little red things at the synaptic terminals to indicate there's actin there, as well as microtubules can connect to the dendritic spines where synapses connect. And it turns out actin can exist in a liquid crystal state, and they use liquid crystals as logic gates in optical computers. So I'm picturing this as a quantum optical computer. The state of the microtubules, you can think of like guitar strings, and then we've got microtubule associated proteins forming frets to fret particular chords, and electrical activity on the membrane lets in calcium through voltage gated calciums that channels that are all over the dendrites. So the intracellular calcium concentration mirrors the pattern of electrical activity on the membrane. And so the calcium is how that information, that pattern, can be imprinted onto the microtubules, so that you can imagine the calcium strumming the chord that represents what you're thinking of at that moment. And so this picture also shows how the membrane potential can talk to the microtubules, and this gives a way to imagine how the microtubules can talk to the membrane potential by modulating synaptic release probability at these synaptic terminals, where we know synaptic release, this might not be widely appreciated outside of neuroscientists, but inside the brain, synaptic transmission is notoriously unreliable or noisy. If you get an action potential here, you might only have a 10% chance of releasing neurotransmitter. And so that's a puzzle. Why would you have unreliable or noisy synapses? It might be so that you can modulate them with your microtubule state. That's a concrete picture to imagine how they could be working in there. And so I told you direct evidence that they can support a quantum state at room temperature. And then this seems to have just dropped into the ether and disappeared. But we have multiple papers from this group showing direct biophysical evidence of a quantum entangled state, macroscopic entangled state in the living human brain. They had just using a regular old MRI scanner. Anyone could try to replicate these experiments. They just set their settings to unconventional settings in order to try to isolate an entanglement signal. They found a signal that looked like the heartbeat evoked potential, but they argued you shouldn't be able to see that. This is not an electrical recording. We shouldn't have been able to see that, but they did. And they said it was evidence of an entangled state in the brain. And moreover, the fidelity of that signal, one of their subjects fell asleep in the scanner and they saw the fidelity degrade. And they also correlated the fidelity of the signal with working memory performance. And so they conclude not only is there a macroscopic quantum state in there, it's probably related to our consciousness and cognition. So yeah, there's evidence out there. I found one paper of someone saying they don't believe the result, but they did not have an alternative classical explanation of the signal. So far, this seems to stand as evidence for quantum brain.
But so just in a broader context, I mean, you pull together these different results, but how broad is the community that is looking at these interconnections? Okay, yeah, answer. It connecting it that way or following that line of reasoning in order to establish the argument to make the test. I mean,
Not too many.
it's really interesting to me.
Even people that are starting to open their minds to considering a quantum model are very nervous about Orch-OR because you hear that it has quantum gravity in it, and that sounds nuts.
Oh, I got it.
But it's not
Yeah.
really quantum gravity, is my
Okay.
message about that. But yeah, objective reduction is already an added level of controversy beyond whether it's quantum, and then his particular version of objective reduction,
Yeah.
referring to gravity, makes
Yeah.
people very nervous.
Yeah. Yeah. I can see that.
With respect to that, there was a recent headline about Penrose's Orch-OR theory being disproved by experiment. It was fake news because there are two. This is kind of a sidebar, but there are two. They call it the DOC Penrose scheme. Another physicist named DOC came up with one of the same formulas as Penrose, but under a different theory that had different empirical predictions from Penrose's. It predicted a certain extra radiation, which was not observed, so that ruled out DOC's version, but it didn't rule out Penrose's version, but for some reason the headline said Penrose
Yeah.
is dead.
Well, that gets more clicks. Yeah.
Yeah. That was somewhat frustrating for him.
Oh yeah, right, the clickbait. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then this paper, this seems to be a secret that Friston and Fields now think their theory is quantum, but there's a whole field of active inference out there that doesn't seem to have read this paper, as far as I can tell.
That's really true. But I had a conversation with Carl about Chris Field's work, and he said absolutely. He said, I'm totally in we're of one mind, and also and Michael Levin's saying the same thing, but it has it.
I haven't heard Michael Levin say that. Michael Levin thinks it's quantum?
Yeah, I mean, well, he's one of the authors in that paper. I mean,
Oh yeah.
he is.
Yeah.
I mean, and so there is this tight affinity between the three of them, and so I find that quite. But then I asked Mike, well, then what about microtubules? And he said, well, I haven't looked into that.
I asked him too. I asked him the results that he has about his worms that he cuts their heads off, and they have a memory of how many
planaria
heads.
stuff. Yeah.
I asked him, can you block the memory by blocking microtubules? And he said something like, yeah, well, I want to try that. But I think it's been a year since I asked him that, and I haven't heard any.
No, I mean, it just seems an obvious direction to go, and at least to experiment. But
He should put anesthesia on his little worms. And if I'm trying to get the topic of my other talk that proposes the relation between active inference and Orch-OR, I'm trying to get that published now at Computational and Structural Biotechnology Journal. I think it's one of Friston's co-authors who is my reviewer, and he's good. But I'm just saying that in case you can put in a good word with Carl.
Yeah. No, I mean,
if he might glance at my paper at some point.
Yeah. No, I bring that up. I mean, we can make the transition to the Friston stuff, and I revisited the paper and it's so on the mark.
Okay, let me tell you what we're leaving out.
Okay.
In the other part of that talk, and I sort of said a little bit about the binding problem already, and I told you I thought a classical model was ruled out because of that. I claim that there's a way to avoid that epiphenomenalism problem for the quantum model, and so I'm just throwing that out there if you want to come back to that later, but happy to go to the active inference discussion if you want to do that.
Yeah. I mean, because I do think that he comes at it at a mathematical theoretical point of view, but all around free energy principle, free energy minimization, variational free energy, but also then the Markov, the concept of the Markov blanket and the self-evidencing, to me, it provides a very rich general theory. I mean, one of the things I'm interested in is sort of how do you create artificial sentient systems? What are the components that you need to have in it, and what does it have, and how do you build something on a free energy principle, free energy minimization, these are kind of agents that we're playing with, um, and just to throw out something, one of the things that, and I put this out with some trepidation a little bit, but if you look at large language models and you see that they're basically sort of tensor networks, they're Hilbert spaces, they're in a sense you have all this there are a trillion parameters that everything is so in some sense entangled. And then you have, in a metaphorical, I'm not saying this is not a real quantum reference field, but then you have a prompt in which you then take something and you collapse it into a particular set of intentions that you try to reduce into a causal model. This is the kind of thing we're looking at. So like you have an active inference model that is causally oriented, that then it builds up you build up your local context, you build up your own Markov blanket, um, and so it is this interchange between, this is the kind of interchange between the two of those things that allow it basically it learns on that basis. It is actually samples that space, but trying to collapse it into terms that are like the causal models in a active inference model. So I find that we're getting pretty interesting results from that, because you can actually you create your own semantics, you create your own vector databases that and this is the work that is not dissimilar to Marcus Buehler's work. Are you familiar with that at all? Um, no, I really encourage that. He's at MIT. He's the dean of engineering there, but he talks about what he creates psi agents recursively, and he looks and uses them in terms of material science in order to make fundamental discoveries. And so it goes from exploring these massive spaces to recursively specifying new kinds of materials that satisfy certain kind of conditions, and he's making massive progress on that. If you can look at his work on LinkedIn, but he documents things very well. But he has a very robust program there.
I'll check that out. I want to see if you are aware of this literature about quantum cognition. When you started talking about entangled concepts and projecting into smaller spaces, there is this big literature, particular about question order effects, where we answer questions in an apparently irrational way some often, and you can formalize this and get really amazingly specific quantum predictions if you assume, yeah, that our mental state is like a vector in the huge Hilbert space you were talking about, and then a question projects you into a subspace. You can explain a bunch of these effects that are weird otherwise. And so people are trying to see, there are a few papers where people are trying to see if they could get classical neurons to behave that way. I'm giving my opinion there that I think that's probably not going to happen. But just so you know, that might be an angle even in large language models to get to the next level.
So I mean, so when you what's maybe you send it to me at some later point with the literature on
A
that.
review? Yeah, I could send you a review.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
I
There's some
mean,
pretty cool results there.
and to this point, do you know? Are you familiar with David Silverspeig at Harvard Medical School? His work. David is he was former dean there, but he's also head of neuroscience and psychiatry. And David's he was also on our podcast. And David is very interested in collaborating on this new, and he's in the backyard, So,
What was the
um,
last name?
Silverswig,
Silverstein?
Swig, SWEIG, Silverswig. I mean, and he's very much into the interdisciplinary approach in doing this kind of modeling. And so I think that we should set up a time. Because we're trying to work in a broader group across Harvard and MIT on this new way of thinking. And you have at Harvard now with the Kempton Institute, you have the largest cluster for academic cluster for sort of
So,
computing.
new way of thinking, you're referring to active inference?
Well, and no, and also the quantum consciousness. I mean,
Okay.
is open to, and he's an open-minded person. Just put it that
Yeah,
way.
even with respect to that? Okay, just checking.
Yeah,
Because
that's what I was saying. Yeah, yeah, yes. Not just the active inference, but also
cool.
I was sort of bringing these ideas, and the antibodies weren't out there, so I think it's the receptivity to this.
Okay, good to hear. I'll look them up.
Yeah, yeah. No, we'll follow up on that.
So with respect to this idea, I think instead of starting right into this introduction of active inference and getting to my point at the end, since you started talking about how general the free energy principle seems, let me start at the end by saying how what I meant when I said the dynamic that the universe is using is the same one that we're using in our brain. On some level, that's trivially true because we think we're a physical system. But what I'm referring to is the dynamic that quantum physics uses to evolve its wave function and then collapse. And the dynamic, you can cast it in terms of free energy, but I think to me the more natural and fundamental way is in terms of least action.
Well, that's right. I was wondering to go to the least action because yes, and then that okay, and I yeah, I see that.
And so, because we're talking about in between two measurements now in quantum theory, maybe I should, before I go to quantum theory, maybe I should make the point about this least action principle plays a role both in classical and quantum physics. You can formulate physics in terms of this least action principle, but in classical physics, and before I say that, this least action principle is sort of a integral point of view, a holistic point of view, because it's about the best way to do something over time rather than if you're at this moment, what's going to happen next. So classical physics, we can formulate either way. We can formulate it in terms of Newton's laws that say if the forces are this and the speeds are this, then this is what's going to happen next and for all time. Or you can say we start off this way, and where's it going to be at this time, and you can figure that out by finding the minimum action path, right? The least action path. So that's the integral point of view. And in classical physics, it's sort of optional. That integral point of view can be more convenient for systems with complicated constraints, but in principle, you could figure out the answers by just thinking about local forces. But in quantum physics, you basically have to use the integral point of view, the least action point of view. And so this can be confusing to people because the first way most people learn quantum physics is that the postulate is the Schrodinger equation, and you start from there. But really, the Schrodinger equation is not a general postulate. You can recognize that by noticing that it doesn't include spin, and it can't deal with relativistic physics. So that's not the basis of quantum physics. The basis of quantum physics is the path integral, or in my view, the most fundamental way of formulating physics is the path integral formulation, because it works for everything. It works for quantum field theory, where you are taking into account spin and relativistic. Your theory is completely relativistic. But still, what it does is it it calculates the transition probability from this state to this state in terms of all the possible past trajectories to get from those, and it's doing an optimization problem as a minimization of the action. So the insight here is the universe is constantly doing an optimization.
That's what my takeaway was. Yeah, that's right, right.
And so if biological creatures find a way to map their personal problems onto this optimization dynamic, they have the most powerful optimizer working for them.
So this is what one of the points that we're making in terms of developing sort of social institutions, economic institutions, and so how do you align them with those set of principles, and how do you embed that in a kind of economics? And I won't go there right now, but that's where
that's beyond my qualifications.
But it's anyway. I just think it's extremely powerful, and if you can make that alignment and then translate into what is economic value in terms of some kind of least action principle, and you can show something is actually creating new value, then you don't get into problems of monetary policy and fiscal policy. But I will.
That's pretty good. Yeah.
You see where I'm going with that?
I think so. Yeah. And you're doing the same thing as with free energy to decide, whether you should go search for more food or eat what you have, stuff like that.
Exactly. And right now we're stuck in sort of Newtonian market concepts, which it doesn't learn, it doesn't accumulate. It's just clears in some sense.
I have heard of the concept of bringing relativity into economics. Does it just mean finite time for effects to happen?
Oh, I mean, finite time. Yeah, I mean, basically, what you're trying to do is minimize uncertainty, and through action and observation, and then be able to and since you can do that across different scales, then you have comparable measurements. But you don't get into and also, I guess, it recognizes you're working with the confines of a Markov blanket. I mean, and so it is a living thing. So it has boundary conditions and that therefore it has its own sort of homeostasis it has to maintain, right? I mean, whereas classical economics doesn't see it that way. I mean, it doesn't. It's not. This means it's more biological than sort of mechanical.
Right. But so the theory is what the agent should do if it can.
Yes.
And so there's a question. There's lots of evidence that brains do something like this active inference. But the critique that I'm raising here is it looks implausible that classical neurons could do those computations.
I think, yeah.
And so that's not widely accepted, and I think I'm the first maybe to say it, or I'm trying to get it published. But I try to make it as a systematic argument, not just a gut feeling. And I think there's good evidence to support.
I think that I think it's sort of self-evident, but anyway. It sort of follows from
the reviewer says the burden of proof is on me, not the field. I'm sort of framing it as the field is relying on really one or a couple papers. Okay, so one of the kinds of computations you got to be able to do if you're going to implement active inference is you got to be able to add stuff. There's all this matrix multiplication. And to do matrix multiplication, you got to multiply and you got to add. And so can we get realistic neurons to add? Well, here's a paper from 2006 that gets referenced by everybody. And there aren't a lot of these. There's just this one. It's not super realistic. It doesn't have the Hodgkin and Huxley conductances in it. And to get good straight line out of this, they have to average over more than 1,000 neurons and more than 1,000 trials. And this is an operation we want to be able to do in one trial. So does that mean we would need 1,000,000 neurons? So considerations like this and others suggest to me that although there are these process models, lots of papers showing if you assume certain kinds of neurons that are Poisson firing rates, idealized neurons. Here I have another slide with the idealizations. These are a list of things that it doesn't seem has been established in classical neural models, even just the adding. And you're using attractor states in order to sort of get answers, but other people have pointed out these need to be attractor states across the whole brain, and there's conduction delays and sensory inputs coming in that will tend to be disrupting such a thing. And even if that weren't happening, it takes hundreds of milliseconds for attractors to settle down. So it just doesn't seem fast enough. It seems like you don't have enough neurons or enough time to do it with classical mechanisms. And so that's how I come to the suggestion that, well, in my talk, I pointed out that Fields and Friston already said biology must be quantum. So we're done. But nobody seems to have read that paper. And there is something that you get from Orch-OR that you don't get from just saying quantum. And that's an explanation for this problem that I haven't raised yet. But the fact that our moments of consciousness are like discrete frames of a movie rather than being a continuous stream, as it seems intuitively. And you can prove this with psychophysical experiments like backward masking experiments. Backward masking experiment is illustrated by this bottom picture here, where this is what people were looking at on a screen. They're fixating on the dot in the middle. Then these two bars come up very briefly while they're still looking at the dot in the middle. And their task at the end is going to be to say which of the two bars was bigger. And you can only answer that if you see it. But the masking, backward masking, refers to the fact that if you flash these masking stimuli, these pairs of bars, which are not in the same place, but just next to where these bars were, if you flash these briefly right after these, you can prevent the person from seeing these. And so that proves that it takes some hundreds of milliseconds to become conscious of something, because you can wipe it out by messing with the brain within that time. There's other effects like this flash lag effect, where there's a moving bar and this bottom bar just flashes at the instant the moving bar passes that spot. And so they're perfectly lined up in reality, but what you see in your percept is the moving one seems to be ahead. And David Eagleman did a clever version of this experiment where the moving one bounces instead of continues, and he proved that the percept is generated by, it's a post-diction, a so-called post-diction. It's generated by integrating over some past time and then deciding what to see. And it seems like something like that had to be true anyway if we were going to perceive motion. But these masking experiments show that it's not a continuous update, it's actual frames. And you can see correlates of those in the neural recordings, EEG. It looks like bursts of synchronization across the brain at each moment of consciousness. So this is during a binocular rivalry experiment where your two eyes are being shown two different things. Instead of seeing the overlap of the two pictures, you tend to see one for a few seconds and then the other one. And this is showing bursts of gamma synchronization or high frequency synchronization correlating with these moments of seeing one picture or the other. So consistent with the idea that these little bursts of synchronization are the substrate of the frames of our conscious movies. This Orch-OR hypothesis associates our moments of consciousness with moments of collapse of the wave function of the microtubules in our neurons. That's why it comes in discrete moments. That state of the microtubules is in a superposition for some hundreds of milliseconds, and then objective reduction happens. It collapses. It decides what it's going to be. It decides what it's going to see, and it manifests that during the collapse. And so that naturally explains who does the path integral, because that's what the quantum collapse is. It's nature doing that path integral, and explains why it comes in discrete chunks. Something I haven't mentioned so far is I said we want our consciousness to be able to have evolutionary benefits, to understand why it evolved. And one concrete likelihood we can consider is that it helps with our memory, because despite the popular idea that we have exponential memory capacity, our classical models are only linear in the number of neurons. So if you have 100 neurons, you might only be able to store 15 memories, and that just goes up linearly. But these, and you know, you hear people saying that quantum computation is hype because there's only a couple quantum algorithms, and they're mostly useful if you're a bank robber. But speed is not the only potential advantage. Memory capacity is another one, and this model from 2000, and now there are a bunch of other similar ones of other people have developed, shows exponential memory capacity. That is,
Wait, is it not true that the idea, I mean, the idea of memory is necessary in fields outside the organism itself? I mean, is that
no.
it's no and no. I mean, that, I mean, you hear Michael Levin will talk about this, you know, in bioelectrical fields, and actually when he talks about the planaria and you'll have, you know, chops up the brain, different kinds of heads. It's not stored in the
DNA.
in the biology of the itself. It's outside. It's in these fields.
My response to that, okay, he showed it's not in the DNA, I believe,
Yes, right. It's not in the
but
DNA.
but that field won't be there unless the biological organism is there. The field is being generated by the ions moving around. So, and he talks about the ion channels
Yeah,
that he
yeah,
thinks are
that's true.
probably
That's true.
involved.
It's true.
And so without those ions in their places, you're not going to have that field. And so to me, that's what is creating the field. That's where the energy, the information is probably stored. And now the field may have some effects. Like
Right.
I'm relying on the field to establish entanglement across the synaptic gap between neurons, for example.
Right.
But
Right.
I don't think all the substrate or all the consciousness is just out in the field. I don't think that really makes sense. Although I know some people think that way.
So, yeah, yeah. So, and I think what was it? Stuart was saying, Hemmer, I think at the conference was saying that it was 1 billion to the 30th power. Did you? I said,
I don't
whoa.
remember what was that.
Well,
Maybe
that was when
that
I
might have been if you just do the capacity of a microtubule or
that's what I
something,
think it
or
was. Yeah, yeah,
and that is loose because it's similar to saying if you have 100 neurons and each neuron can be in one of two states, then there are 2 to the 100th memory
yeah,
states.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
it's not true
yeah.
in a real neural model. It's way smaller
Much
number.
more. Okay, yeah.
So that's sort of how much is there in principle. We don't know
What in
how we
comparison?
can access it. This is an algorithm for how to store a lot of memory. That the algorithm that they developed by marrying a known quantum search algorithm called Grover's
Oh, this
algorithm.
is Grover's album. Okay, yeah, yeah,
It's combining Grover's algorithm with a neural network architecture. So Grover's
ah,
algorithm just gives you a square root
yeah.
improvement in speed, but this gives you an exponential improvement in capacity.
Got it.
So that
Okay.
could be huge.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
could, you know, we can remember stuff for 100 years, and LTP, that is our main model of how that works, only lasts a couple weeks.
yeah,
So maybe we need a quantum side to that story of memory as well as consciousness.
yeah. Very good.
All right, I can talk all day about this, but we are nearing the
Well, we're getting it, but no, this is fabulous.
great.
I really think, I mean, to get back to where we started, I think like the two key points we wanted to, and William Blake, I'm a big fan of William Blake, so
All right.
yeah, I collected his work. Yeah, uh, um, but I just did an excellent job in terms of making the point of microtubules and the fact that it is at room temperature. We have quantum state, which is like that just changes everything. And then I think also the tie into active inference is another angle of understanding these things and putting another framework to it is very powerful. So I laud you on your work and your effort.
Thank you.
Swimming
Thank you.
upstream too. I mean,
A little bit, yeah. Yeah. So on that active inference point, I'm saying it looks like active inference is right in the sense that it does describe real brains, but it looks like the classical implementations that people have proposed probably can't work, and
yeah,
that's why I'm suggesting Orch-OR can do it and can also explain the discrete perceptual cycles.